March 9th, 1942. A train pulls into Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow blankets the ground. Armed guards stand watch as a single prisoner steps onto the platform. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He is the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces in World War II. Sakamaki's submarine had attacked Pearl Harbor just 3 months earlier. Now he stands in the frozen heartland of America, thousands of miles from home, expecting execution or worse. What he doesn't expect is what comes next. Over the next 3 years, fewer than 6,000 Japanese soldiers would join him in American captivity, a tiny fraction compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs held on U.S. soil. These men were the rarest of prizes, Japanese soldiers who had broken the ultimate taboo of their military code. They had surrendered. Their story reveals something unexpected about America's wartime character, not through propaganda or patriotic rhetoric, but through the simple, documented reality of how a democracy treats its enemies, even in the midst of total war.
To understand why there were so few Japanese POWs, you must first understand the culture they came from. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army issued the Senjinkun, the Code of Battlefield Conduct. Its message was clear and absolute: death before dishonor. Surrender was not merely discouraged, it was unthinkable. A Japanese soldier who allowed himself to be captured had, in the eyes of his nation, ceased to exist. The numbers tell the story. At Guadalcanal, where American forces captured the island in 1943, only a handful of Japanese soldiers surrendered out of thousands killed. At Saipan in 1944, Japanese soldiers and civilians chose mass suicide over capture. Thousands leaping from cliffs rather than face the shame of surrender. Even at war's end, on Okinawa, Japanese resistance was suicidal in its intensity. When American soldiers did encounter Japanese troops attempting to surrender, they often faced deadly deception. Booby-trapped bodies, fake surrenders concealing grenades. These tactics, born of desperation and ideology, created a vicious cycle. American troops grew reluctant to accept surrenders, and Japanese soldiers saw their darkest propaganda confirmed. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Rogers, who would command the POW camp at Camp McCoy, later wrote, "These men believed they had already died. They had no families, no country, no future. We were guarding ghosts." And yet, despite everything, some did surrender. Wounded, unconscious, or simply broken by the reality of war. These men, approximately 5,400 in total, would be transported across the Pacific to the United States, to camps in Wisconsin, New Mexico, Texas, and other inland states. They expected torture. They expected death. What they found would challenge everything they believed about America and about themselves.
The journey began on hospital ships crossing the Pacific. Many Japanese POWs arrived injured, malnourished, or suffering from tropical diseases. They had been told by their own propaganda that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant torture, mutilation, even cannibalism. Instead, they received medical treatment, clean beds, regular meals. It must have seemed incomprehensible. From West Coast ports, trains carried them inland, past mountains, across deserts, through farmland that seemed to stretch forever. For men from a small island nation, the sheer scale of America was overwhelming. Camp McCoy, in the rolling hills of central Wisconsin, would become the largest permanent Japanese POW camp in the United States. At its peak, it held nearly 3,000 Japanese prisoners, alongside thousands of German and Korean POWs. The camp was massive, 35 buildings within a 20-acre enclosure, part of a military installation that sprawled across thousands of acres. The prisoners arrived in the dead of winter. Many had never seen snow. The cold was brutal, foreign, but so was everything else. The barracks were wooden structures, each housing 50 men in bunk beds. Not comfortable by American standards, but far better than the conditions they'd known in the Pacific Theater. There was electric lighting, running water, toilets that flushed. Sergeant Arthur Hotved, a guard at Camp McCoy, later recalled, "They just stared at everything. The lights, the heating, the amount of food. I don't think they could process what they were seeing." The camp was divided by nationality. Japanese prisoners in compounds 1 and 2, Germans in compounds 3 and 4, and Koreans in compound 5. Barbed wire and guard towers marked the boundaries. Military police patrolled with dogs. This was still a prison, but it was a prison unlike any they'd imagined.
The Geneva Convention of 1929 established international standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, unlike Japan, had ratified this agreement and was bound by its terms. But America did more than simply meet minimum standards. It created a system that, by the measures of total war, seemed almost generous. Meals were served 3 times daily. Japanese POWs received steamed rice at least once a day and soy sauce with every meal, accommodations for their traditional diet that went beyond what the Geneva Convention required. The portions were substantial. Many prisoners, accustomed to the severe rationing of wartime Japan, had never eaten so well. A typical breakfast might include rice porridge, bread, coffee, and fruit. Lunch, rice, vegetables, meat, or fish. Dinner, more of the same, with occasional Western dishes. The American Red Cross made regular inspections, documenting conditions and ensuring compliance with international law. Work was mandatory under the Geneva Convention, but the labor was regulated. POWs worked no more than 12 hours per day. They received payment, actual US dollars, in camp scrip. German prisoners enthusiastically participated in work details, seeing no conflict with aiding the enemy in non-combat roles. Japanese prisoners were more conflicted, many initially refusing work they saw as collaboration. Those who did work performed various duties: kitchen patrol, camp maintenance, motor pool repair, construction, carpentry. Some became barbers, welders, or medical technicians. They learned trades. They earned money they could spend in the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, personal items. But it wasn't just about meeting physical needs. The Americans understood that idle prisoners made trouble, so they created opportunities for education, recreation, and spiritual practice. The Japanese prisoners had access to a library, sports facilities where they played baseball and other games, a chapel that was converted for Buddhist worship. The prisoners needed incense for their religious ceremonies, so the YMCA provided it. Think about that. In the middle of a war against Japan, American civilians were supplying religious materials to captured Japanese soldiers. There were English classes, film screenings, visits from the Red Cross and other aid organizations. At Christmas, some American volunteers brought gifts. One of the guards, interviewed decades later, remembered, "We'd see them doing origami in the barracks, making these incredible paper cranes and flowers. Some of them started teaching us. Here we are, supposedly enemies, and we're learning paper folding from each other." The Japanese prisoners generally refused to be photographed, part of their deep shame at being captured. But Lieutenant Colonel Rogers managed to document some of their daily lives. His photographs show men playing baseball, attending theatrical performances they'd organized themselves, even staging a POW Olympics in 1944. These men, who believed they had died the moment they surrendered, were being given the chance to live.
For prisoners raised in Imperial Japan, a militarized, hierarchical society where the emperor was divine and obedience was absolute, American democracy was profoundly alien. They watched guards and officers argue politics. They saw newspapers that criticized military strategy and questioned government decisions. In wartime Japan, such dissent would mean imprisonment or death. Here, it was Tuesday. The racial dynamics bewildered them. Black soldiers guarded white prisoners. Women worked in military roles. The rigid social hierarchies they'd known didn't apply, or at least applied differently. America had its own prejudices and inequalities, certainly,
But the fluidity, the debate, the visible tensions of democracy, these were foreign concepts. Some POWs were assigned to work details outside the camps, helping with agricultural labor in nearby communities. Wisconsin farmers, desperate for workers as young men went to war, employed German and some Japanese prisoners to harvest crops. These prisoners saw American family farms firsthand, the machinery, the yields, the casual abundance that Americans took for granted. One prisoner, interviewed after the war, remembered, "The farmer's wife brought us lunch in the field. Sandwiches, fruit, cold milk. She treated us like hired hands, not enemies. I couldn't understand it." At some Wisconsin camps, guards reportedly took prisoners to local cafes for lunch during work details. Can you imagine? Enemy soldiers sitting in American diners being served hamburgers and coffee by civilian waitresses. It sounds impossible, but multiple sources confirm it happened. The threat of escape was minimal. Where would they go? They were thousands of miles from Japan, in a land whose language most didn't speak, whose geography they didn't understand. And increasingly, some didn't want to leave, because what they were witnessing day after day was something their propaganda had never prepared them for. America wasn't weak because it was democratic. It was strong because it was democratic.
If there was a single moment that broke through the propaganda, it was when Japanese POWs glimpsed America's industrial might. Japan had gambled on a quick war. The military leadership believed America was soft, divided, unprepared. They calculated that a brutal early blow, Pearl Harbor, would give them 6 months to secure the Pacific, while America struggled to respond. What they didn't anticipate was the awakening of an industrial colossus. Consider the numbers. In 1944, America produced more aircraft than Japan had built in its entire history. The United States Navy, by 1945, was larger than every other navy in the world combined. American shipyards launched a new vessel every day. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, cargo ships, in numbers that defied belief. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan built B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line over a mile long. At peak production, a finished bomber rolled off that line every 63 minutes. Every hour, another heavy bomber, 18 per day, equipped and ready for combat. Think about that. The Japanese military knew each airplane they lost was irreplaceable. America was building 18 heavy bombers a day at a single factory. And Willow Run was just one facility. Across America, factories that had made cars now made tanks. Plants that produced refrigerators now built artillery shells. The Willow Run plant alone produced 8,685 B-24s before the war ended. In 1944, that single factory produced nearly as many aircraft as the entire nation of Japan. POWs transported by train witnessed this power firsthand. They saw freight trains miles long carrying tanks, trucks, artillery pieces. They passed through industrial cities where factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, producing the weapons that would defeat their homeland. They saw farmland, endless, mechanized, producing yields that made Japan's agricultural output look primitive. They saw women working in factories, doing jobs that in Japan would have been unthinkable. They saw racial minorities in military uniforms in positions of authority. The diversity itself was strategic. America could draw on its entire population. Every demographic group contributed. In Japan's rigid system, half the population, women, were largely excluded from war production. Koreans and other conquered peoples were exploited, not mobilized. The comparison was stark. One Japanese officer interviewed after repatriation said, "We thought America was weak because people argued and disagreed. We didn't understand that arguing and disagreeing was how they solved problems. Their strength came from the same place as their chaos." Another prisoner wrote in his diary,
They defeated us with resources we could never match. But more than that, they defeated us with a system we never understood. How do you fight a nation that trusts its own people?
The treatment of enemy prisoners is one of warfare's most revealing tests. How does a nation behave when its enemy is helpless? What does it do when the world isn't watching? The historical record shows that American treatment of Japanese POWs, while not perfect, was remarkably humane, especially given the context. This was a brutal war. American soldiers had seen their comrades tortured and executed by Japanese forces. They'd witnessed the Bataan Death March. They knew about prisoner camps in Burma and the Philippines, where Allied POWs were systematically starved and worked to death. And yet, at Camp McCoy and camps across America, captured Japanese soldiers received medical care, education, religious freedom, fair treatment under law. There were no successful escapes from Camp McCoy, not because escape was impossible, but because many prisoners realized they were safer and better fed than they'd been in their own military. Consider Ensign Sakamaki, that first prisoner. He arrived at Camp McCoy in March 1942, consumed by shame, attempting suicide multiple times. His guards stopped him, not with punishment, but with patience. Eventually, he began to teach origami to guards' children, small moments of connection across the divide of war. Or consider the nameless prisoners who learned English from their guards, who taught Japanese to curious Americans, who played catch with GIs in the exercise yards. These weren't propaganda moments. They happened in the mundane reality of daily life, documented in guards' memoirs and prisoners' letters. Arthur Hotvet, that guard from Camp McCoy, remembered a Japanese prisoner telling him, "You Americans do everything backward. You argue instead of obeying. You question your leaders. You let women tell you what to do." He paused, then said, "But somehow it works." This doesn't mean America was perfect. The treatment of Japanese Americans during the war, citizens forced into internment camps, remains a dark stain on American history. The same nation that treated enemy POWs with relative humanity imprisoned its own citizens based solely on ancestry. But that contradiction itself reveals something about democracy, its capacity for simultaneous justice and injustice, its messiness, its ongoing argument with itself about its own values. The Japanese POWs saw this too. They saw a country wrestling with its principles even in wartime. That complexity, the ability to criticize, to disagree, to gradually correct course, was itself a kind of strength their rigid system couldn't match.
Repatriation began in late 1945, after Japan's surrender. The process took months. The last Japanese prisoners didn't leave Camp McCoy until October 1945. The last German prisoners remained until June 1946. For the Japanese POWs, going home meant facing shame. Japan did not publicly acknowledge that any of its soldiers had surrendered. The government had told families their captured sons were dead. Letters sent from POW camps in America had been intercepted, never delivered. These men were returning to a country that had officially erased them. Some chose to stay silent about their experiences. Others, gradually, began to speak. In post-war Japan, during the American occupation and the rebuilding that followed, some former POWs became educators, reformers, voices for democratic change. They'd seen something most Japanese citizens hadn't: a working democracy under stress. They'd witnessed a nation that, despite its flaws, treated enemies with a baseline of dignity. They'd experienced a society that valued debate over obedience, question-asking over blind loyalty. The numbers, in the end, are striking. Approximately 5,400 Japanese POWs held in American custody, virtually no successful escapes, high rates of cooperation with intelligence gathering. Many prisoners, having broken ties with their homeland, provided valuable military information to the Allies. In Soviet custody, by contrast, Japanese POWs faced brutal treatment in Siberian labor camps. Some weren't released until decades after the war. The difference in treatment was stark and deliberate. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing Japan's post-war reconstruction, later wrote, "I know of no nation more serene, orderly, and industrious, nor in which higher hopes can be entertained for future constructive service in the advance of the human race." He was describing the Japan that emerged from defeat, a democratic Japan, shaped in part by men who'd seen democracy work, even in the confines of a POW camp in Wisconsin.
War reveals character, both personal and national. The Pacific War was one of history's most savage conflicts, fought across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, marked by atrocities on both sides and a mutual dehumanization that made killing easier. In that context, the treatment of Japanese POWs in America stands as a quiet counterpoint. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. Not because it erased the war's brutality, it didn't. But because it demonstrated something important about democratic values under pressure. When a nation is strong enough to treat its enemies with basic dignity, even in wartime, it reveals a particular kind of strength. Not the strength of brutality or absolute control, but the strength of self-confidence. The strength of a system that doesn't need fear and cruelty to maintain order. The American guards at Camp McCoy weren't saints. Many held prejudices. Many had lost friends to Japanese aggression, yet they followed rules. They treated prisoners according to law. They showed small kindnesses, teaching English, sharing cigarettes, explaining baseball rules that cost nothing but meant everything. The Japanese prisoners weren't saints either. Many remained loyal to Imperial Japan. Many struggled with the shame of surrender until their dying day. But they witnessed something, a system where strength didn't require oppression, where abundance didn't require conquest, where power could coexist with basic human decency. The lesson isn't simple patriotic pride. The lesson is more complex and more valuable, that how we treat others when we have power over them defines us more than our military victories. America's greatest weapons in World War II weren't the B-24 bombers rolling off assembly lines every hour, though those mattered. They weren't the destroyers and aircraft carriers that dominated the Pacific, though those were decisive. America's ultimate weapon was its system, a democratic system that, for all its flaws, created space for innovation, debate, diversity, and human dignity. A system that could be simultaneously strong and humane, industrial and individual, powerful and principled. The Japanese POWs who spent years at Camp McCoy witnessed that system up close. They saw its contradictions, the treatment of Japanese Americans contrasted with the treatment of enemy soldiers. But they also saw its possibilities. And when they returned to Japan after the war, they carried that knowledge with them. Not propaganda, not rhetoric, but lived experience. The memory of a nation that, even in total war, still believed its own principles mattered.
Today, Fort McCoy remains an active military installation in Wisconsin. The POW camps are gone, demolished after the war. Only foundations remain, marked by historians and archaeologists. The buildings where thousands lived, worked, and contemplated their strange captivity have returned to Earth. But the story persists, in archives and memoirs, in academic studies and historical records, in the memories of guards' descendants, and in the silent reflections of prisoners who never spoke of their time in American camps. Approximately 5,400 Japanese prisoners of war, a footnote in the vast narrative of World War II. But their story illuminates something essential about the conflict, that war is not only about destruction, but about the values we preserve or abandon in destruction's shadow. America didn't win the Pacific War because it was more brutal than Japan. It won because it was more productive, more innovative, more resilient. But it also won because, at critical moments, it chose to remember that even enemies are human beings. That choice, to maintain standards even when standards seemed inconvenient, to honor principles even when principles demanded restraint, was itself a kind of victory. The garden behind the wire,
humanity in the midst of war, democracy tested and imperfectly sustained. That is the legacy of Camp McCoy, and of the unexpected prisoners who glimpsed America's promise from behind barbed wire.